This is, of course, most importantly, a year of leadership transition in China. The process starts at the 5-yearly National Party Congress in October and will be substantially completed when the new government is formed at the National People's Congress, the equivalent of the Parliament, in March next year. China has, over the last 30 years or so, developed pretty well for the first time in its millennia of civilised history, a fairly settled pattern for the emergence of new leaders. And we celebrate at this time, this first half of the year, the 20th anniversary of the famous southern tour of Dung Xiaoping, the central hero of China's modernisation, when, especially in his visit to Shenzhen, he drove at the age of 88 further and faster reforms and internationalisation, just as elements of the party leadership appeared to waver towards retreating into protectionism and conservatism following the protests of 1989. And elements and echoes of that debate are again on the agenda as key players seek to influence the emerging leadership. And there's more at stake. There's more in play now, because some people in China are writing about China as starting to enter an age of prosperity, such as the two previous such ages people often talk to are the Hai Qing period, 17th century, and the middle years of the Tang dynasty, when China's capital was Chang'an, the contemporary Xi'an. And those are periods that people look to as wonderful times of stability, settled life, and civilization in China. And some people are talking about today seeing something like that, Sheng Xi, time of prosperity, age of prosperity. One of Deng's core contributions as the hinge figure in China's modernisation was to recast the style of leadership from the charismatic, single leader focus that China had seen before, the emperors, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, into a group who emerged through administrative experience in the party, usually, or not usually, always, having to spend most of their formative years as party officials in provinces, not in the centre. Those people rule chiefly through consensus, and their rule is limited to 2 5-year terms. The first such team, Jiang Zemin as party secretary, and then Li Peng was replaced by Zhu Rongji as premier. They implemented a big range of reforms and opened China up to the World Trade Organization. The second team, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, who are in their last few months in power, promised to shift the focus from the quantity and the pace of growth to one of quality of growth, to harmony, the word, a Confucian word, which they brought back as Confucius has returned as one option amongst some to provide an underpinning set of values for modern China. After 2,450 years, Confucius has made quite a comeback. My view is he can only get so far, and there's only so much you can get in terms of running a contemporary state from him. There are many other groups vying with ideas for the underlying values. A group who were identified as the New Left, who are worried about the growing and massive wealth disparity in modern China, which is much greater than that we see in the United States, for example. And the wealth is utterly in the hands of party members and party elite, of course. People were worried about that disparity and feeling it's necessary to go back to some of the egalitarian and redistributive values of Mao Zedong. And that group has sort of transmogrified into what some people would call the new right. championing statism, the state as the goal of modernity, the state itself as the paradigm, and marvelling to an extent at some of the forms of state that emerged a long time ago in imperial China. And those people see the universal values that people have talked about bringing into China, the sort of values which include the idea of rights as being a form of Western Trojan horse, akin to the opium that Britain wanted to introduce through the two opium wars. So universal values, the new opiate, and trying to combat that and instead install statism as the new underpinning value. So this team of Hu and Wen, in my view, were only partly successful in rebalancing the economy in that more distributionist direction, in the direction of quality of growth. The problem really was that the party's key form of legitimacy has relied on an unwritten contract that Dung Xiaoping devised between the party and the people. We maintain, we ensure rapid growth in living standards. You let us govern as we continue to govern. And there's a lot of nervousness, particularly on the part of people, provincial leaders, that once you start putting the brakes on growth, then you start imperiling that contract, and there's nothing much else in its place. Very interesting. Such a dominant organisation, in my view, the most powerful organisation in the world today. I can say this as an Anglican and not as a Roman Catholic, more powerful than the Roman Catholic Church, and yet intense worries about its legitimacy and its source of that. And we'll come back to that when we talk about the sexy events in Chongqing. So there's a big open question about the new leadership. The new leaders, like Hu and Wen, emerging with qualities to do with being good committee men, and I mean men, because no woman has ever managed to join the standing committee of the Politburo in China's history, the nine men who run China. So, like Hu and Wen, now we see Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang emerging as the two leaders likely to take over. Again, people who are regarded as good at consulting, good at producing consensus within the party and its factions, about which I'll talk a bit in a minute. Xi Jinping, a son of a veteran party leader and acolyte of Dung Xiaoping, and is likely to take over as the General Secretary of the party, the number one title. The number two title is Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and then the third title in importance is that of President of China. The President title is there to give him status when he travels internationally, but not so important in terms of power. It's being General Secretary of the party, of course, that gives him the power. And Li Keqiang is being almost certain to replace Wen Jiabao as the Premier. So there's a lot of debate about the need for economic reform. I should preface my remarks by saying there's no need for Australians to panic. China is not going to stop buying our resources. There is a sort of gravitational pull of urbanisation in China, and all you have to do is to look at what's happened in China's neighbours, to look at where China is very likely to head. China's still got a long way to go in urbanisation. Now we're seeing just over half of the population is urban, but there's still a lot of underemployment in the countryside and inefficiency, and we're also seeing a demographic shift. After 2020, the population will stabilise and then may even start to fall, and that requires a better educated and better rewarded workforce, of course. So that demand will keep going. Among the questions people are asking, will China's currency, the yuan, will that become the world's reserve currency? There's a lot of talk about China overtaking the United States and so on. Of course, China's per capita income remains a very long way behind the US and a very long way behind its neighbours. Something like an 11th of the average earnings in Taiwan, something like a 12th of the average earnings in South Korea, and then something like a 20th of Hong Kong, and about a 30th of what people earn in Japan. So if we look at that process, I don't believe it's going to be easy to stop. People will want to earn more, but at the moment we're not talking about a middle class such as we know it here. We're talking about people still with fairly limited incomes. Will China's currency become the world's reserve currency, taking over from the US dollar? I don't always agree with what he says, but Stephen Granville, who was Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, summarises this quite well. He said, it would have to offer open access to a range of low-risk assets, providing an assured adequate return. These investments need to be readily traded in markets, deep enough to ensure that the price won't fall sharply as the assets are sold. Foreigners need assurance that they could convert their renminbi into foreign currency at a fair exchange rate. This requires a well-established bond market with depth, breadth and resilience. It has to have strong legal certainty, a track record of stable performance, probably requires a floating exchange rate. China has none of these preconditions, and of course the currency is not convertible on the capital account, and China's in no hurry to create them, because it would mean giving up all the panoply of controls and regulations that keep the exchange rate stable and guard against the potential huge volatility of unrestricted capital flows. What's more, the advantages of being a reserve currency aren't worth the price. I think that's right. But China's very happy to see the renminbi used more for trading, including, of course, with Australia. One of the figures likely to feature in the new Politburo Standing Committee is a man named Wang Yun, who's the party secretary of Guangdong province, the province next to Hong Kong. And as you would know, the party secretary is, of course, the top man in the province. The governor is under him, just as the party secretary in a city, a municipality, is the top person. The mayor is under him, and so on. So if you're meeting the party secretaries where you're going, you're meeting the people who are making decisions. Otherwise, you're meeting people who will be party officials, but not at that level. Wang Yun was a figure who was in Chongqing municipality, the controversial area I'll come to in a minute, and there was going to be, I've written before about this last year, there was going to be a big contest which of Wang Yun or Bo Xilai would end up on the Politburo Standing Committee. Well, it now looks like Wang Yun is going to go there, so it's quite important to hear what he has to say. He said, early this year, he said, 30 years ago, the reform focused on shaking off the shackles of ideology. Today's reform must focus on breaking the constraints of the existing pattern of vested interests. If the direction of reform is decided only by this interest structure, the reform can no longer proceed. He talked about China being stuck in a transition trap with these vested interests blocking necessary reform. The China Youth Daily, in commenting favourably on Wang Yun's speech, said this: "In the early days of reform, crossing the river by feeling the stones," which was a Dung Xiaoping phrase that he used about pragmatism, was a practical choice. At present, the problem is that some people enjoy feeling the stones so much they don't want to cross the river anymore. Very nice phrase. And so this is the sort of concern and issue that's being debated at the moment. The long-term plan is for China to wean itself off its reliance on exports and investment projects such as roads, railways and overpriced property developments, and for domestic consumption of goods and services to play a much bigger role in fueling growth. But this rebalancing will be a long, hard road. Officials don't want shock therapy because it could threaten the jobs of many of the 200 million migrants who come from the countryside to provide the cheap labour behind China's exports. But something has to happen. People are talking about limits to growth. This is a bit scary. The World Bank, I'll talk about in just a sec, the World Bank has talked about this, and many people in China used this phrase when there was a terrible train crash in Wenzhou, on the outskirts of Wenzhou, about 9 months ago, when 40 people were killed. One of China's high-speed trains, its much vaunted new technology, 2 weeks before the crash, a senior official at the Railways Ministry had stood in front of a press conference, and he'd answered a question about exporting the technology, and someone had said, you're competing with the Japanese, and he laughed and said, we are so far ahead of the Japanese that it's not worth thinking about. And so that's come round to bite him, and of course I don't think they're going to succeed in exporting this technology, and as soon as the crash happened, Japan redoubled its marketing efforts because it's never had a fatality, touching wood, on the Shinkansen. So limits to growth. And limits internationally. I'm not going to talk much about the international environment. There's only so much I can say in half an hour. But internationally, we're seeing some limits. We've seen to emerge from the confrontations about access to the South China Sea, we've seen China's neighbours over the last 2 years very quickly looking to the United States for comfort and support, and expressing anxiety about China's ambitions in that area. Very important for us because about 2/3 of our exports and probably about the same amount of our imports, I suspect, flow through that sea. And China's soft power, its influence internationally, appears to be hitting some limits as well. So a lot of big questions for these new leaders. We don't really know actually too much about them. There's quite a debate inside China about economic reform. Political reform is much harder for the party to cope with, but economic reform is a fairly open area for debate. Hu Shuli, she's probably regarded as China's leading journalist in some ways, founded a magazine, economic magazine, and now a very successful website. She says this: The state's heavy hand creates and sustains monopolies, stifles competition, and undermines a fair market. Empirical evidence repeatedly shows that state capital is less efficient than private capital. Moreover, it creates room for officials to seek personal gain. China's high-speed rail development, with its series of corruption scandals, is a microcosm of a sick system. Because of their ties to government power, institutions that deploy state-owned capital have easy access to financial support and government contracts. They can also lobby decision makers and manipulate the laws to their own advantage. And we've seen China's economy, she says, hitting a limit under this outdated model of development. Whether China can now re-engineer a new path of growth and avoid the middle income trap, getting so far and then just trundling along, flatlining, as we've seen Latin American countries do, and as I believe India will do, that will depend on its determination to transform itself. And we've seen since the global financial crisis, the state-owned sector increase its hold, its access to capital, and people are saying, surely now the party has to try to persuade the banks to open their doors to the private sector to borrow, and has to try to encourage greater consumption. The Economist describes China's banks shoveling workers' savings into state-owned enterprises, depriving workers of spending power and private companies of capital. And of course, virtually every company in Australia we have dealings with is a state-owned. It's not a private company. I don't think there's any substantial Chinese private company in the resources game. So this process that's coming up here, we see the Central Committee of the party has 350 people, and it's going to hold in a couple of months its final plenum to finalise plans for the National Party Congress, the 18th Party Congress in October, which is going to be a particularly challenging one. When it meets, finally, what we hear about the 25 members of the Politburo, and then, as I was there last time this happened, the 9 come out from behind a big screen, a dragon screen, and then they walk. I think they all had dark suits and red ties, except for one of them had a blue tie, but I'm not sure what that meant. And then we didn't know until they were out who would actually be in the 9. Many people think that this time only those 2, Xi Jinping, the number 1, Li Keqiang, the premier, will stay in. And the other 7, all going to be new people. I will put money, as I said, on Wang Yun, my man in Guangdong, to be one of them. And but we don't know who the others are. They emerge, much as the leaders of the British Conservative Party used to, after exhaustive rounds of consultations between the party grandees at country house parties. Susan Shirk, a very eminent sinologist based in San Diego, talks about how things working in the party. She talks about it having reciprocal accountability, rather like a chief executive being accountable to a board, but also often having a big say about who are the other directors on the board. So this is what we have, a sort of reciprocal accountability between people at the top of the party. And probably the worst thing someone can do is to step forward, step out of line, upset the consensus. Consensus between who? Consensus between factions. A man named Chung Li, who's at Brookings Institute, has fine-tuned his diagnosis, and he makes great lists of who's in which faction. I'm not sure that it's quite like that, but it's widely regarded as a useful tool, and other people have suggested further extensions. We have the Taizedang, the princelings, the children of party greats of the past. Some of them may have gone into outer darkness during the Cultural Revolution, but these are people associated with the party in its founding era. And their children, the Taizedang, Xi Jinping is one of them, have a lot of clout. They're people who have a lot to lose if there's any rapid change. The second group is the Tuanpai, Tuanpai is the pinyin, and this is the people who are in the Youth League, which Hu Yabang really led, and Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao are both Youth League figures. And the Youth League is associated more with technocrats, then also have a smaller subgroup, the Shanghai clique re-emerging. Cheng Liangyu, who was the party secretary in Shanghai, was found guilty of corruption and purged. And that Shanghai, which Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji were from that clique, were outer. But now they're sort of back. Jiang Zemin is the party elder, and so the Shanghai group have their own influence. And, of course, People's Liberation Army. It's the party's army. It's not the government's army. So the party runs the army, not the government. And many statements unequivocally back that view. So these groups try to vie for the most members on committees, the most influence. It's hard to say what particular policies each espouse, but they, the skill of running the place is to try to balance all this off. And in the meantime, sifting through the 350 and who's going to come top, we have the organisation department of the party, the central party school, senior bureaucrats, all working in this sort of guided democracy, this wanting to slightly extend their consultations. And there's some talk of the members in the Congress being given more candidates than seats to vote for, a revolutionary idea. Now, a lot has been. In Australia, we tend to focus very much on the economics, and people here just tend to want to hear about business and economics as if this is something of itself and not associated with how China is run. And I think that's rather odd, but it reflects the poverty, the poor state of study of Chinese society and Chinese life and history in our tertiary institutions and other places. Because at base, this is not an economic story. Dung Xiaoping embraced growth through partial market mechanisms, not because he'd read a Western economic textbook and seen the light. He did so to rebuild his country's strength from the ruins of Maoism and to ensure that it could continue to be ruled by the party he belonged to since his teenage days in France, and which he could present as the one force capable of making China great again, entering this age of prosperity after a century and a half of decline. The basic story is one of power and politics, as it always has been in China, and the rest of the world needs to understand that in this year of the dragon. And what better way to look at it than through the events in Chongqing? I don't know if you've all been following this, but it started in February actually. Bo Xilai, who's the party secretary of Chongqing, was formerly the mayor of Dalian in the northeast, received a lot of praise, attracted a lot of foreign investment there. Then he became commerce minister in Beijing. People I know said he was a very bad commerce minister, didn't really like foreign investment and trade, and was a problem. And then he went to Chongqing anyway, as the party secretary. A man of some charisma, son of a Bo Yibo, one of the greats of the past. And he there started this policy of Cheng Hong, sing red songs. So he got everyone communal singing of songs from the Mao era. The second policy was Da Hei, hit the black, so fight against crime. So lots of people were locked up. Suddenly they were accused of being mafioso or whatever. The norm, even in China's terms of, China is a country really without law. The law is a function of administration, not really a separate area. But even so, there are some ways of doing things. Those were all defied. Lots of people were locked up, lots of people were executed, and lots of people on the streets were applauding. And the third thing was Minsheng, distributive policies. So he borrowed about $1 trillion yuan, about 160 billion US dollars, Australian dollars, to do things like promising to build 800,000 apartments in 3 years and so on. Where would this money be repaid? No one really knows. Constant postponement, growth by investment, and the household sector, China's own household sector, eventually actually pays for all this. He's a person who is earning $26,000 Australian a year, but is immensely wealthy, it seems. His son, Bo Guagua, has been driving around Beijing and now Boston in a red Ferrari, and the son was at Harrow School in England, then Oxford, Balliol, and then he's at Harvard. His wife, Gu, his second wife, lots of stories about how wealthy she is. Lots of people are talking about tens of millions of dollars. She worked as a lawyer. She's been a go-between between foreign investors and so on. So he made a lot of money. He's become hugely popular on the streets of Chongqing, promoted himself, a very charismatic, upfront figure. And suddenly what we heard was a man named Wang Yun turns up at the American consulate in Chengdu. Chongqing is really part of that big area of Sichuan. It's sort of cut out for administrative purposes. And he drove through the mountains there, mountainous area where the pandas are from and so on, to Chengdu. And was there for 10 hours, mysterious hours. And then it re-emerged and was taken into custody by the Beijing security people, party people, and has been there ever since. The Chongqing police were outside as well. They wanted him. It appears he was scared for his life. Then after that, we heard about a guy named Nick Haywood. His body was found and in a hotel in Chongqing. They said he'd drunk too much and he died, and they quickly cremated the body. And then after Wang Yun was taken into custody in Beijing, quickly stories were circulating by Weibo, by the equivalent of Twitter in China, saying that this was connected. There's a connection between these events. And it now appears what quite likely happened was that Gu had been making a lot of money, and that Nick had been a sort of consigliere to the Bo family, and giving advice and acting like some foreigners as a go-between, being paid for getting licenses, for getting government approvals, being paid by both parties for getting foreign investment in, and then helping set up foreign accounts by which the ill-gotten gains could be parked offshore. Very common theme. And this started to emerge. The government keeps closing down these Weibo, and then the new ones start up and so on. So the message got out quite quickly. So people's views of what Bo Xilai was doing has started to change, and people are saying, maybe in fact what we're finding out is what they're all up to. This is really what they're all up to. And a lot of anxiety about this. We don't really know much more. Some people are saying that Haywood and Gu were having an affair, that they lived together for a year in Bournemouth. I come from England originally, maybe not the place you'd most imagine for a glamorous, A-League couple. But anyway, so quite interesting what happened there. We really don't know. So it raises a lot of interesting questions. Very hard for the government to keep that sort of information quiet anymore because of the ways things leak out quickly. They get out and then people quickly close. The government, the net police, close it down, but already people have copied it onto their hard drives and so on, and they're passing it around. So very hard to keep that type of thing secretly. Gu has been portrayed as, she's been charged with murder. It's been said that she poisoned him, Haywood, because Haywood was threatening to reveal what they're up to with their scores of millions of dollars, and that raises questions as well. China, like many other countries, has a problem with women, and so she's portrayed as a sort of Lady Macbeth figure. She's the one behind it all. Poor Bob didn't know about it, and so on. Rather like Zhang Qing was portrayed as the mastermind of the Gang of Four and the bad things that happened in the Cultural Revolution. So people have said this is the fault of Bo for personalising things, using his charisma. The party hates this type of personalisation and so on, and now is trying to smooth over what's happened. But a lot has come out, and it's going to be quite difficult for them to put back the genie in the bottle. And so what will she do? I'll just finish quickly now. What will she do? He appeared with Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao as a signal to the cadres that there's solidarity in the leadership. Recently, they were all there together. He might do a tour, like Dung Xiaoping's tour to the south, and praise Wang Yun's efforts to build up a reform pace, which they are more happy with, and maybe use Guangdong as an example and allow it to do one or two things, which he's urged. He's likely to do something to placate the armed forces, some of which appeared sympathetic towards Bo's efforts to make Chongqing a hub that had already benefited the military. So she seems to recognise that rather than trying to mobilise the masses, as Bo Xilai did and got himself into deep water, the best hope for reform is to appeal to the policy-making apparatus. And that's more likely what we'll see, a return to the focus of stability, maintain stability as an aim.